Right now, as you're watching this, something extraordinary is unfolding on the ground in Ukraine, something the mainstream media won't tell you about, something that fundamentally changes the calculus of this entire conflict. We're witnessing what appears to be a carefully orchestrated trap, months in the making, and Russian forces are walking straight into it. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't about Ukraine winning or Russia losing. This is about a much deeper game, one that involves NATO expansion, the dollar's dominance, and the complete restructuring of global power that's been accelerating since 2022. The trap that's been set reveals something critical about modern warfare and geopolitical strategy. Ukrainian and US fighters have been laying groundwork that most analysts completely missed. They've been studying Russian doctrine, anticipating movements, and creating conditions that turn Russia's own strengths into catastrophic vulnerabilities. What we're seeing isn't conventional warfare anymore, it's fourth-generation conflict where perception, timing, and strategic deception matter more than raw firepower. And the implications of this moment extend far beyond Eastern Europe. This affects energy markets, grain supplies, military budgets, and the entire architecture of global security. The question isn't whether this trap will succeed, it's what happens to the world order when it does. Now let me walk you through exactly what's happening here, because the details matter tremendously, and they paint a picture that's vastly different from what you're getting from cable news or even from most alternative media sources. What we're looking at is a convergence of tactical brilliance and strategic patience that's been building since the earliest days of this conflict. You see, when Russian forces initially moved into Ukraine back in February 2022, there was this assumption, both in Moscow and in many Western capitals, that this would follow a certain pattern. The Russians had overwhelming firepower, numerical superiority in many areas, and what appeared to be clear strategic objectives. But here's what nobody fully appreciated at that time. The Ukrainians, with substantial support and intelligence from American and NATO partners, weren't preparing to fight the war that Russia expected. They were preparing to fight a completely different kind of war. Think about how insurgencies work, how asymmetric warfare functions when it's done right. The weaker force doesn't meet the stronger force head-on in a fair fight. That's suicide. Instead, you create conditions where the enemy's strengths become liabilities, you make them overextend, you make them commit resources to objectives that seem important but are actually draining their capacity, you make them fight on your terms, not theirs, and most importantly, you make them believe they're winning right up until the moment they realize they've lost. This is Sun Tzu at the most fundamental level, but it's being executed with 21st century technology and intelligence capabilities that Sun Tzu couldn't have imagined. What's been happening over the past several months is that Ukrainian forces, working in close coordination with American military advisors and benefiting from real-time satellite intelligence that's frankly unprecedented in the history of warfare, have been systematically identifying weaknesses in Russian positions, supply lines, and command structures, but they haven't been exploiting all of these weaknesses immediately. That's the key insight here. They've been patient. They've been waiting. They've been allowing Russian forces to settle into certain positions, to establish what they think are secure corridors, to build confidence in their defensive arrangements. And all the while, the Ukrainians have been mapping everything, understanding the patterns, identifying the dependencies, and planning for a coordinated strike that would hit multiple critical points simultaneously. The trap itself is multidimensional, and this is where it gets really sophisticated. On one level, it's a straightforward military operation designed to encircle and isolate Russian units that have pushed too far forward or have become dependent on supply routes that can be cut. We're talking about classic encirclement tactics that go back to Hannibal at Cannae, but executed with precision-guided munitions and drone reconnaissance that allows Ukrainian commanders to see the battlefield in ways that simply weren't possible even a decade ago. When you can see where every enemy vehicle is, when you know exactly where their ammunition depots are located, when you understand their communication networks and can disrupt them at will, you can orchestrate movements that seem almost miraculous to people watching from the outside. But here's where it gets deeper, and this is the part that really matters for understanding the broader geopolitical implications. This trap isn't just about destroying Russian units or reclaiming territory, though those are certainly objectives. It's about demonstrating something to the world. It's about proving that the Russian military, which has been portrayed as this near-peer competitor to NATO, as this formidable force that could potentially challenge Western dominance, is actually far more vulnerable than anyone realized. And that demonstration has consequences that ripple through every calculation being made in capitals, from Beijing to Tehran to Ankara. If Russia can be trapped, encircled and defeated by a smaller force using Western tactics and weapons. What does that say about Russian power projection capabilities? What does that say about their ability to defend their allies or pursue their interests in Syria, in Africa, in Central Asia? The United States has been playing a very careful game here, and we need to understand the American strategic calculus because it's absolutely central to how this trap was conceived and executed. Washington has been providing Ukraine with just enough capability to be effective, but not so much that it triggers a direct confrontation with Russia that could spiral out of control. This is a delicate balance, and it requires constant recalibration. The provision of HIMARS systems, for example, gave Ukraine the ability to strike Russian logistics and command posts deep behind the front lines with a precision that fundamentally changed the tactical picture. But these systems came with restrictions. Initially, Ukraine wasn't supposed to use them to strike targets inside Russian territory proper. That restriction shaped how the trap was designed. It meant that Ukrainian planners had to create conditions where Russian forces would move into areas where they could be hit without crossing those red lines. Now, as this trap springs, we're seeing Russian units that believed they were in relatively secure positions suddenly finding themselves under coordinated attack from multiple directions. Their supply lines are being cut by precision strikes. Their command posts are being targeted by intelligence that seems impossibly accurate. Their communications are being jammed or intercepted. And critically, their ability to respond with their usual tactics, massive artillery barrages, overwhelming firepower, is being degraded by the destruction of ammunition depots and the targeting of artillery systems themselves. This is what modern warfare looks like when one side has information dominance and the other side is operating partially blind. The human cost of this is staggering, and we shouldn't lose sight of that even as we analyze the strategic dimensions. Russian soldiers who are walking into this trap are, in many cases, conscripts or contract soldiers who have limited understanding of the broader geopolitical game being played. They're following orders, trying to survive, and finding themselves in situations where their training and equipment are inadequate for the threats they're facing. Ukrainian forces, despite their tactical advantages, are also taking casualties and dealing with the immense psychological burden of combat. War is hell, as Sherman said, and the fact that this particular hell is serving larger strategic purposes doesn't make it any less horrific for the individuals involved. But we have to zoom out and look at what this means for the global system, because that's where the real story is. Russia's prestige as a military power has been a cornerstone of its international influence for decades. It's how Moscow maintains its position as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's how Russia sells weapons to countries around the world. It's how Putin projects strength domestically and maintains his grip on power. If that prestige is shattered, if the image of Russian military competence is destroyed by this trap and the defeats that follow from it, the consequences cascade through the entire international system. China is watching this very carefully, and Beijing's calculations about Taiwan are absolutely being influenced by what's happening in Ukraine right now. If Russian forces, using Russian doctrine and Russian equipment, can be defeated by a smaller opponent using Western systems and tactics, what does that tell China about its own prospects in a potential conflict over Taiwan? The People's Liberation Army has been modernizing rapidly, but much of its equipment is based on Russian designs or Russian principles. If those principles are fundamentally flawed when facing American military technology and doctrine, then China's entire military buildup might be less intimidating than it appears. This doesn't mean China won't act on Taiwan. There are many other factors in that calculation, but it definitely changes the risk assessment. Iran likewise is drawing lessons from Ukraine. The Islamic Republic has relied on Russian military support and Russian diplomatic backing at the UN. If Russia is revealed as weaker than expected, if Moscow can't even secure its interests in a neighboring country that it views as essential to its security, then what kind of security guarantor can Russia be for Iran? This affects Iran's nuclear calculations, its regional ambitions, its willingness to confront Israel and Saudi Arabia. The entire Middle Eastern power balance is linked to perceptions of Russian strength, and those perceptions are being revised downward in real time. But let's talk about what's happening at the economic level, because the military trap is connected to an economic squeeze that's equally important. Russia has been trying to finance this war while under the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. The ruble has been volatile, Russian businesses have been cut off from Western markets and technology, and Moscow has been forced to redirect enormous resources toward military production at the expense of civilian economic development. The trap that's unfolding militarily is compounded by an economic trap that makes it increasingly difficult for Russia to sustain its war effort over time. Western policymakers understood from the beginning that this would be a war of attrition not just on the battlefield but in the economic realm. Russia's economy is large and resource-rich, but it's also deeply integrated into global markets in ways that create vulnerabilities. Europe's decision to wean itself off Russian natural gas, though painful and expensive in the short term, has deprived Moscow of one of its primary sources of leverage and revenue. The price cap on Russian oil has forced Russia to sell its petroleum at discounts, reducing the income available for military spending. The freezing of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions was an unprecedented move that essentially confiscated hundreds of billions of dollars that Moscow thought were safely stored abroad. All of these economic measures create conditions where Russia has to make increasingly difficult choices. Do you spend scarce resources on replacing destroyed military equipment? Or do you invest in your civilian economy to prevent discontent among the population? Do you prioritize maintaining your defense industry, or do you ensure that people have access to imported goods and technologies they've become accustomed to? Every choice involves trade-offs, and those trade-offs become more painful as the war drags on and as military losses mount. The trap that Ukrainian and American forces have sprung is designed to accelerate this process of attrition. By destroying large amounts of Russian equipment and isolating Russian units, Ukraine forces Moscow to commit even more resources to simply maintaining its position, let alone advancing. It's a strategic calculation that looks beyond individual battles to the long-term sustainability of Russia's war effort. And there are signs that this calculation is working. Reports from inside Russia indicate growing concerns about the availability of certain weapon systems, difficulties in recruiting and retaining soldiers, and increasing tensions over the economic impact of the war. Now, I want to address something that's often missing from mainstream coverage of this conflict, which is the question of what victory actually means and what endgame we're moving toward. The trap that's being sprung right now could lead to significant Ukrainian territorial gains and could inflict severe losses on Russian forces. But does that end the war? Does that bring Russia to the negotiating table in a serious way? Does that create conditions for a sustainable peace? These are enormously complex questions, and the answers depend on factors that go well beyond the tactical situation on the ground. Putin has staked his entire political legacy on this war. He's portrayed the conflict as an existential struggle for Russian civilization against Western imperialism and NATO expansion. For him to accept a negotiated settlement that looks like a defeat would be politically catastrophic, potentially even threatening his grip on power. This means that even as Russian forces suffer significant losses, even as the military situation deteriorates, there's enormous pressure on Putin to continue the war in hopes that something changes. Maybe Western resolve weakens, maybe Ukraine's backers reduce their support, maybe Russian forces adapt and find new approaches that work better. From the Ukrainian perspective, the goal is to inflict sufficient damage on Russian forces that Moscow has no choice but to withdraw and accept Ukraine's territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. But that's an enormously ambitious objective that requires not just tactical victories but a sustained strategic campaign that breaks Russia's will to continue, and it requires maintaining Western support over what could be years of continued conflict. The trap that's unfolding now is a significant step toward that objective, but it's not the end of the story. The American position is perhaps the most complex of all. Washington wants to see Russia weakened and wants to demonstrate the superiority of Western military systems and doctrine. But the United States also has to worry about escalation risks, about the possibility that a cornered Russia might resort to nuclear weapons or might lash out in other dangerous ways. There's also the question of China. The more resources and attention America devotes to Ukraine, the less bandwidth there is for managing the strategic competition with Beijing. Some voices in Washington argue that the Ukraine conflict is a useful way to degrade a potential adversary without direct American involvement. Others worry that it's a distraction from the real strategic challenge of the 21st century, which is managing China's rise. What we're witnessing right now is a moment of truth in this larger strategic competition. The trap that's been sprung could mark a turning point where Russian capabilities are so degraded that Moscow has to fundamentally reassess its ambitions and its approach. Or it could be one more phase in a conflict that drags on for years, consuming resources and lives without reaching a clear resolution. The difference depends on factors that we can't fully predict, on decisions that will be made in Moscow, Kiev, Washington, and other capitals in response to how this tactical situation develops. One thing that's absolutely clear is that the world order that existed before February 2022 is gone. The assumptions that governed great power relations, The norms around territorial sovereignty and the use of force, the economic integration between Russia and the West, all of that has been shattered. And what emerges from this conflict will shape international relations for decades. If this trap works as designed, if Russian forces are dealt a decisive defeat, it could reinforce American dominance and Western cohesion in ways that strengthen the existing international system. But it could also drive Russia into a closer embrace with China, accelerating the formation of an alternative bloc that challenges Western power. It could encourage other countries to develop their own nuclear capabilities as the ultimate guarantee of sovereignty. It could lead to a more fragmented, more dangerous world where military force is seen as a viable tool for settling disputes. The soldiers walking into this trap right now, both Russian and Ukrainian, are caught up in forces much larger than themselves. They're participants in a reshaping of global order that will determine how power is distributed, how conflicts are managed, and what kind of international system we live in for the foreseeable future. That's the real story here. That's what makes this moment so significant. Not just the tactical details of this particular operation, but what it represents in the broader arc of history. We're watching the future take shape in real time, and the outcome is anything but certain.